Hello, everyone. Welcome to Understanding the Stories of the Bible, where we are unpacking the stories from the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. And so we're studying these ancient stories just to see what they mean for us today. They have endured for thousands of years, and there is much to learn from these ancient stories. And we'll get started in just a moment, but first, let's pray. God, we thank you for this opportunity to open up your word and to look at these stories and just ask, God, that you would speak to us in our hearts, in our minds, and direct us as we move forward to make things practical, understandable, where we can bring pieces of the puzzle of our life together in place and be able to see things more clearly. And we ask for your help in this in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, the reason these stories are important is because they're part of the Bible. I mean, that's probably the first thing. But because they have endured and movies have been made about them. Books have been written about them. And so these ancient stories just have a way of speaking deep into the heart and explaining the human condition. And when I read these stories, I see just the sketches and the pictures that are being painted that give me personal guidance, I guess you would say, and these stories kind of present wisdom in many different metaphors to be able to guide our life, and that happens to us personally. But I also think that these stories are important for us corporately. And so when I say corporately, I mean anything beyond a single individual. So that would be your home, would be the first thing, your community that you live in probably would be the next level. And then other communities within that bigger, let's say the town or the city that you live in. But it has to do certainly with your town and city, but also your relationships and subgroups in your life. And then also nationally, I think that these stories are ultimately pointing to a national identity. And why is that? Well, because Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible for a reason, for a purpose. And the purpose primarily was not just to give you as an individual and me as an individual direction for our lives, but these stories were also written to give Israel a national identity. And so these stories speak to nations and to kings and to governors, to senators, congressmen, to presidents, to prime ministers, to parliaments. These stories speak to the governance of a nation, and they speak to the culture of a nation. And then that's where it connects probably down to the individual. But it speaks to the culture of a nation. And it's God's way of laying out a blueprint that basically says this: if you want to be blessed on a personal level and in your family, here's how you do it. If you want to live a life that's negative and tough and full of suffering and full of darkness, well, here is the way that happens. And so there is definitely 2 paths: light and darkness, wisdom and foolishness, righteousness and sinfulness. And he lays out these 2 paths very, very clearly in these stories. And so these stories are meant to give us that kind of personal guidance in our lives and our families, but also on a national level. So this is just God's way of saying to Israel, now as a nation, if you want to be a blessed nation, if you want to be a prosperous nation, if you want to be a compassionate nation, and you might even ask, well, what's the definition of a great nation? You know, our president talks about making America great. Other nations talk about making their nations great. And I've been on different continents around the world, and I can tell you that nationalism is strong in every nation. Like every nation you go to, the people of that nation are proud of their nation. They love their nation. At the Olympics, it doesn't matter what nation that they come from. It doesn't matter the economic condition of that nation. You see the flags waving in support of that nation. So people love their nations kind of intuitively. And so we might ask ourselves, well, what makes a nation great? Like, what is the criteria for making a nation great? And that's a good question. And the answer, I think, at least in part, can be found in Matthew 25 when Jesus judges the nations. And Jesus tells this story that he calls together the nations of the earth and they're going to be judged. And there are nations that are righteous nations, good nations, and there are nations that are not righteous and are not good. And some of those nations enter into the kingdom, and there's a sense where they are aligned with the kingdom of heaven, and then there are nations that are not aligned with the kingdom of heaven. So he calls the nations together, and some people look at that judgment not as much as personal individual judgment, but as the judgment of the nations. And if the criteria for judgment then is accurate, which we would probably think that it is in Matthew chapter 25, then Jesus makes a case that a great nation remembers the poor, is concerned for the sick, has a very fair judicial system and penal system. Because he says, I was hungry and you fed me, I was naked, you clothed me, which is care for the poor. He says, I was sick and you visited me, which is health care, compassion for the sick. And then he says, I was in prison, you came to visit me. Well, that's someone in prisons, which speaks to the penal system and the justice system. So at least in some way, what makes a nation great is not just economy. What makes a nation great is to have compassion for the poor, have a just legal system, and to care for those that are sick and weak among us. And so you see this compassion element in the criteria for judgment of the nation. So we would have to say what makes a nation great is its level of compassion. And that is, that seems to be borne out not just in Matthew 25, but throughout the whole scripture. And so when we read these stories in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the 5 books of the Bible attributed to Moses, we have to understand that the purpose of writing these from Moses' standpoint was to create a nation, or at least create an environment in a nation that would take that nation from a slave mentality into a more prosperous mentality. And that's the ultimate purpose of these 5 books. And so Moses then says, okay, if we're going to do that, then let's address the issues that make a nation great. And throughout the books that he wrote, we see that definitely moral righteousness is for sure one of the issues that Moses is very concerned about. A fair judicial system is absolutely one of the things that we find in Moses' law. The idea that the punishment should fit the crime, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, that punishment should fit the crime. Definitely that the poor and those that are the least privileged in society should be cared for in some way or fashion. And that is all through the law. And even how you reap your crops was subject to the idea that we leave some for the poor. I mean, so it's amazing when you read these laws, the things that Moses put there. Having a structure that is aligned with worship with God. And now that's kind of an overarching principle, really, through the whole thing, even the sanitary laws that Moses gave. But these sacrificial laws were meant to align a nation to a higher power. In other words, if there is a nation that has no other recognition of a higher power except the state, which we see in communism and socialism, that if there is no higher authority than the state, it always leads to the oppression of the people, of the masses. Even though, like in the sake of Marxism, where this utopia was offered, someone described it once that in order to create the utopia, it's like having to crack a few eggs to make the omelet. So you kill a few thousand people and you murder people, and you just have to do that with an iron hand. So in other words, we're going to force our utopian ideas upon the masses, And we see then that in those situations, the state was the final authority. We might as well say even the state was divine. And in that environment, there is always oppression of people, because those people that run the state are subject to sin and selfishness. And democracy, on the other hand, starts with a different premise. Democracy starts with the idea that there's no such thing as utopia, and people are corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And it's almost like the initial assumption of our forefathers creating this democracy, or technically speaking, a republic. They created it with this first assumption, which is people cannot be trusted. People in power should be questioned. And so they create a free press, they create free speech, and the idea was the government is run by people, and people are ultimately at the core corrupt. And so the idea that the state is divine is absolutely nonsense, and we're going to create something that assumes that those in power are corrupt, and we're going to lay that at the feet of the people. And I think also our forefathers looked back through history, and they found that every monarch, it's like every monarchy and every kingdom at some point in time gets overthrown by the people. It's almost like a cycle that you see. You have a good king, and when you look at fairy tales, the good king is always desirable. But over time, the good king becomes the bad king. Now, this does have something to do with Exodus chapter 5 through chapter 10 and the plagues. That's what we're going to actually look at today, is the plagues. But I'm just setting it up, just kind of talking about these things that actually have to do with Moses' assumption about Egypt. But follow me here. So you have the idea of the good king, which is always a wonderful concept. But over time, the good king is replaced by a few other kings until you have the bad king. And that's just repeated throughout history. And so our forefathers saw that eventually these monarchies and these earthly governments are overthrown by the people. I mean, it's like the French Revolution. You know, at some point in time, you're going to have someone say, let them eat cake. So far removed from the plight of the average people. They have no concept the way people live, and the people are going to rise up, and the people are going to, with a bloody revolution. And there's exceptions to those. There's the bloodless revolution, I think it's called in England, but or peaceful revolution. But the French Revolution, for instance, was horribly bloody, and so the idea that there would be an overthrow of government by the people eventually is accepted. I mean, that's just part of the reoccurring cycle of history. And so what our forefathers did is says, okay, every 2 years we'll have a revolution called voting for the legislatures, and then every 4 years we're going to have an opportunity for revolution to oust the president if the votes are against him. So the idea was to create and build within the system a revolution, a peaceful revolution called voting every few years. And so the people then have a voice, and the government does change. And so our forefathers had the idea that government, that people are corrupt, therefore they're going to create a government that's ultimately corrupt. So you cannot allow the state to be divine. And this is I think maybe the number one idea that Moses is proposing in these books, especially as it contrasts to Pharaoh in Egypt. Because, and here's my point, this is where I'm trying to get, is that Pharaoh was considered divine, as were many monarchs and kings in that day. And if they weren't divine, at least the monarchs of Europe created, we would call it a doctrine, the divine right of kings. It's like, well, why do you have the right to rule and your sons have the right to rule, or your daughters have the right to rule? Well, because God gives us these rights, and this divine right that gives me the right. God has created the circumstances whereby our family became the prominent family in this land, and so therefore, by God's design, we are going to be your king. And so if there wasn't a divine king, at least in Europe, there was the divine rights of kings. But back to Pharaoh. Pharaoh was a divine king. He was considered divine. He was considered all-powerful. He was considered the representation of the gods of Egypt. and because he was divine, an earthly avatar of the gods, then he was considered all powerful. And you have this idea in the way that Egypt was built. But what happened in Egypt? Well, what happened in Egypt is what happens when you carry the philosophy that the state is the absolute highest authority that there is. And again, when you study the 20th century with communism, where the state was the highest authority, you find an absolute, unbelievable amount of death. Tens of millions. It's thought that Joseph Stalin, what's the number, 50 to 60 million people perhaps, that he may have murdered. And that wasn't just the revolution. Lenin was the one that actually led, or at least, is considered leading the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, the communist revolution there. And so however many people that were killed in the initial thing, Stalin came later just as trying to consolidate his power. And he had these famous purges through the military and through government where people were just slaughtered and populations were slaughtered. The same revolution in China, and God only knows how many people were killed. And so, like we see in the 20th century, this idea that when the state is divine, death reigns. When the state is divine, death reigns. And this is why we need news media, and this is why we need free speech. And we need a healthy news media, because the news media needs to hold power to account. In fact, the news media, I think in some way, at least ideally, and this is not a commentary on present news media, because I'm not sure that we really have the kind of news media that we would call unbiased by any means. I think our news media is divided as politically as our whole nation is right now. But I think ideally the news media is to speak truth to power. It is to hold power accountable. And certainly that is a worthwhile thing. This is the thing the prophets did in the Old Testament with the kings. They held kings accountable. And so in some way, news media should be, in a sense, maybe a secular prophetic voice, or at least in one aspect of that prophetic mandate, which is to speak truth to power, that they should speak truth to power and hold power accountable. And, hopefully that our news media would be able to do that. So, whether or not that's a discussion for another day. Because in our nation, our forefathers had the wisdom to know that the initial assumption is people cannot be trusted with power. Therefore, we're going to implement a triune, the courts, the legislature, and the executive branch. This triune of leadership that is all accountable to each other. It overlaps each other. And so it's brilliant how they created these three entities to be able to hold one another accountable, like in a circle. It's really amazing. And then we have the opportunity to vote, which is the people rising up to get rid of those in power and put someone new in power. That's why we get the government we deserve. All of that. Where did that come from? Where did that come from? Well, secularists would say, well, the Enlightenment, brought our forefathers to this understanding. Well, yes, but the Enlightenment also caused the French Revolution, which, if you read about the French Revolution, was a bloodbath. It was an absolute bloodbath. The murderous rampages that people went on was an absolute bloodbath. And I think, at least from my single viewpoint, the difference is that our forefathers were influenced strongly by a Judeo-Christian ethic. Some would even specifically say a Protestant view of the Judeo-Christian ethic, and were influenced by a godly message and by biblical principles, and that was the difference. And so the Enlightenment may get a lot of credit and airtime for what happened in the United States, what the United States was able to pull off. But as I see it, we had a strong biblical Judeo-Christian ethic, and that idea and that perspective was stirred into the mix so strongly. And you know what? From these stories, that's why they're important. This idea that Pharaoh is a demigod, that the state has ultimate power, it brings on oppression and death. And so when Moses writes this story, why would he talk about the plagues of Egypt? Well, I mean, of course, it's just a cool thing, right? Like, God of heaven is showing his authority and his power over the gods of Egypt, and that's happening. And there's some connection, like the ninth plague was darkness, and maybe the highest god of the Egyptians, and I don't know this for certain, but I think that the highest god for the Egyptians, or one of the highest gods of the Egyptians, was Ra, which was the sun god. And so when the sun didn't shine for 3 days, what do you think that said to the people of Egypt? It said that Ra is not God, that Yahweh is higher than Ra. And so Hepi, the goddess of the god of the Nile, the Nile turns to blood. That's the first plague. And we're going to talk about 9 of the 10 plagues here in just a second. But that was as if God was saying that I am more powerful than the Nile god. And so, being polytheistic, the Egyptians had different gods of the sun. There was a god of seasons that was about life. Of course, the god of the Nile. There were gods that had head like flies, gods that had head like cattle, gods that had a head like a frog. There was Isis, which was a goddess of peace and health and the people. There's flies in the plagues. There's frogs in the plagues. There's like lice and pestilence and sores and boils and people get sick, and it's like, okay, all of the gods, little g, of Egypt are all submitted to the God of heaven. And Pharaoh, then being the example of the gods on earth as a divine individual, that in the final plague of the firstborn, which we're not going to talk about today, I'm actually going to do that next week with reference to the Passover. But the last plague, as probably many of you know, was the death of the firstborn. And so the death of Pharaoh's firstborn, it even smacked in the face of the idea that Pharaoh, you're divine. And it was God saying, you're not divine. And so let's set up the whole story now. Moses is going to confront Pharaoh. So the first layer of the story is you have the confrontation, and it's the protagonist and the antagonist. It is good and evil. It is light and darkness. It is the liberator and the oppressor. Okay, and so every great story has a good guy and a bad guy. Okay, so this is Obi-Wan Kenobi and Darth Vader. Whatever story that you want to use, or maybe it's Luke Skywalker and the Emperor. Like, you see this, and like every great show has the protagonist, the antagonist symbol, and it's the symbol of good and evil. It's the personification of the God of heaven in Moses, and the personification of man-made. Watch this. Of man-made religion and the exaltation of a man to being divine. Okay, so you have Pharaoh, who is being exalted as a man being divine. You have Moses in a completely opposite direction, who is a man submitting to the divine. Here is a man becoming divine. Here is a man submitting to the divine. And you have the personification of Moses and Pharaoh. Pharaoh represents Egypt, a system created by man that is oppressive. Moses, a system created by God that is liberating and life-giving and compassionate. Death, life. Darkness, light. Irritating sores and disease. Life and health and joy. Okay? So there is a clear delineation between the two systems. And now they're coming together, and Moses writes this account to make sure that people understand the difference. So here comes Moses. Let's talk about these plagues. So Moses, first of all, and last week we talked about the burning bush. So Moses has this staff. That's his thing. And the whole story at the staff is cool because God says, throw it away. And it's like the picture of a man just laying down all of your gifts, all of your authority, all of your life, all of your achievements, and not just all your achievements, but all your screw-ups too. It's like lay that down, it becomes a slithering snake. And Moses is afraid of it. Now, a staff is something you lean on, okay? A staff represents the identity of a shepherd. So there are some ideas that come out of what a staff represents. It's something that represents your identity. It's something you lean on. It's something, that you use as a weapon or a tool. Okay, so we might say that it's the way that you've constructed reality, which really, what we see is a result of the way we've constructed our belief system. And so you really see what you believe. And so faith and belief actually precede being able to see or to hear something or be able to perceive reality. And that's why some people just, it's like they have so many, and this is why the enemy really wants to get in our head, and we have to renew our mind, the Bible says in the New Testament, and Satan tries to put strongholds there, because if he can, you create a certain belief system. It's a construct in your mind, and then your brain is trained to see those things that you believe, to hear those things you believe, to feel those things you believe. So in some ways, maybe that staff represents that, and he throws it down, and it becomes a snake with no structure with it at all, and then he has to pick that back up. But when he picks it back up, it is saying in a way that Moses now has had his life recreated, that it's now brand new. This is not the same staff that it was before. You actually released it and threw it down, and it became a cursed thing. A snake is a cursed thing, and Moses was afraid of it and jumped back. So you've actually released that cursed thing, but you picked it back up, now in the image of God, and your identity, Moses, has changed. Your worldview has changed. Your construct of reality, all of that has changed now, and you have to be this way because I'm going to send you back to Pharaoh. So he comes back to Pharaoh. He comes in Pharaoh's court, and Pharaoh, the message is, when he gets to Pharaoh's court, is let my people go. And of course, Pharaoh's not about to do that, because Pharaoh is divine. Who are you to tell me? Who are you to speak of a higher authority than the state? Okay, and so we have the personification of Egypt and its gods and its system in Pharaoh. We have the personification of Jehovah and God's plan and system for a nation represented by Moses. And so Moses comes into the court of Pharaoh and says, let my people go. And Pharaoh says, no, I'm not going to do that. So Moses says, okay, well, let me show you what I learned. And he threw down the rod that became a snake. Well, the magicians of Pharaoh, which these guys are kind of they're a sideshow, I guess you'd say, in the whole story, because what they're able to do is they're able for a little while to mimic the ideas that Moses is bringing. They're able to mimic the plagues. They're able to mimic the power of God for a season. Now, they are unable to reverse it. The magicians were totally unable to stop it. They were unable to bring comfort and relief to the people. All they did was try to mimic the divine. And so you have the magicians coming from Pharaoh's court. Again, the whole idea that man is divine, which goes back to the Garden of Eden when the serpent said to Eve, you shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. So the whole idea that man is divine, that man is in charge, that I make my own way, that there's no higher authority than the state. All of that is represented by the mimicking of the divine by the magicians. And so they do this. They throw down their staves, and, whether it's smoke and mirrors, or whether there's some forms of magic that go beyond the human ability in our scientific understanding of things, that goes beyond that veil and they were able to tap into, who knows? But the ideas are the same. And the reality is, it is the court of Pharaoh attempting to mimic the divine. But what happens is that Moses' snake eats the snakes of the magicians. It's like gobbles them up. And so, that's pretty evident what that means. That the true divine is going to swallow up all of the counterfeit or mimicking the divine that is brought forth by the state and brought forth by darkness and brought forth by humanism, that ultimately God will swallow them up. And Moses' snake swallows up the other snakes. He lifts up his rod. It's a rod again. And Pharaoh says, well, nice trick, okay, but my heart is hard, and I'm not going to let your people go. Now, this brings up a question, and I have a lot of people ask me this question. It's like, well, how fair is it that God hardened Pharaoh's heart? It's like the thought there is, how unfair is it? Because how could you hold Pharaoh accountable if God hardened his heart? And so the thought would be that God just came down and God says, well, here, boop, I'm going to harden your heart. So boop, he just hardens his heart. And so Pharaoh has no free will in the matter. He has no say in the matter. And so God just hardens his heart, and Pharaoh has to follow what God has done in his heart. So Pharaoh, in a sense, is not responsible for having a hard heart. So therefore, he's really not responsible for the decisions that he makes because of that hard heart. Well, God can harden his heart, but here's the way I understand it, and maybe this is oversimplifying the whole idea. And I will say, definitely from an ancient Near Eastern perspective and from a Jewish perspective, as influenced by the ancient Near East, but the ancient Jewish perspective is echoed in the words of Paul in Romans, where he basically says, well, who is the clay to tell the master, why have you made me this? Now, I say that because there is a landing place, especially in ancient Judaism and maybe contemporary Judaism. There's a landing place that says, look, God's God. He can do whatever he wants. I mean, who are you to question God, or who are you to say it's not fair what God did to Pharaoh? Okay. Now, that there's a landing spot there. Okay. So honestly, there's places, and I think in our walk of faith, there's times where we just have to land there, right? I mean, there's been things in your life, hasn't there, where you didn't understand, but you just had to say, well, God's God. And I don't like it. I don't understand it. People don't like things they don't understand because they have made their understanding and their intellect the God of their life. Okay? Does that make sense? Like, some people are just really disturbed. I just don't understand. I just don't understand. Well, why do you have to understand it? Like, really? Because our culture values empirical evidence so much, and we value education so much, and because we're so scientific in the way that we approach things, is that what we don't understand, we don't really believe and we don't accept. I can tell you, life is full of things we don't understand, and when you come with a perspective of a Christian or really any religious kind of monotheistic, maybe, perspective, let's say a Jew or even a Muslim for that matter, that there are many things that you just don't understand and you don't have the answer for. Well, there's a landing place, and this is a strong landing place, and probably one that we have to land from time to time, where we just say this: I don't understand, but I don't have to. Okay, it's not like my understanding becomes the absolute exalted filter through which everything that God does in my life has to go through this little straw called my understanding. I mean, how do you put Niagara Falls through a drinking straw? Well, that's like trying to put God in your understanding and mine. And really, it's like we're only going to accept the part of Niagara Falls that I can get in my drinking straw. Well, good luck with that, because you're going to get a little bit of water, and I suppose you could say, here's the water from Niagara Falls, sure, but compared to the broad spectacle of Niagara Falls, that straw is nothing. And so our understanding is just incapable of really comprehending the fullness of God. And so there is a landing spot that we are all forced maybe to go to at one time or another in our life. And I think even with hardening Pharaoh's heart, and this is echoed again, if you're a New Testament scholar, you know that passage in Romans where Paul just says, well, who are you, clay, to say to the potter, why have you made me this? And in that same passage, he talks about God saying, Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. And then I don't have time to really get into that, but it's like God hated him. Well, how fair is that? Paul is actually supporting the idea that there's many things we don't understand, but in a walk of faith, it has to be just that, faith. At some point, there's a landing spot of faith in our lives, in our situations, where we just have to say, I don't like it and I don't understand it, but I choose to believe God. Now, what often happens is once we live through that crisis, we're able to look back and find God. But maybe in the moment, it was really hard to find God in that crisis. And I get it. I've been there. Later on, you're able to find God a little bit more clearly with 20/20 vision, looking backwards. But at some point in time, there's a landing spot that just says, look, God's God. Why do we have to understand it? And that's a good question. Why do you feel like you have to understand it before you accept it? Uncle Buddy Robinson, which is an old Nazarene preacher, holiness preacher from the early 20th century, he said, I don't understand how a black cow can eat green grass, give white milk that makes yellow butter. But that doesn't mean I'm not going to eat my toast dry. Now think about what he just said. He doesn't understand the process, how grass becomes butter. But he doesn't have to. He likes it and he's going to put it on his toast. So you don't have to eat your toast dry just because you don't understand process. And we don't understand process of most things. I don't understand how this camera works. Honestly, it's a pretty amazing instrument here, this camera that I'm looking into every week, and how it gets on a little chip that big and I can put it in my computer and edit things down. That's pretty amazing. I don't understand how it works, but it works. And there's a landing place like that for Pharaoh's heart and for issues in our life. So that's one landing point. But let me give you another perspective on the whole idea of Pharaoh's heart being hardened. And I do believe this. This is not just a fancy idea. I really do believe this. I believe that Pharaoh's heart, the pre-existing condition of Pharaoh's heart, because he was so proud and so arrogant and so exalted and believed himself to be so divine, and he was so all-authoritative, that created a particular heart that when confronted with divine authority, hardened and rebelled in the presence of divine authority. Now, use this as an example. If you put wax in the sunlight, the sun melts the wax. If you put clay in the sunlight, the sun hardens the clay. And so you might say, well, what does the sun do? Does the sun melt things or harden things? And the answer would be yes. The sun both melts and hardens things. But it's the pre-existing condition of the matter upon which the sun shines that determines the outcome of that substance. And so we might say that the sun shined on Moses at the burning bush and Moses' heart melted because Moses had a different heart than Pharaoh. Pharaoh's heart, because of his position and his history, when the sun shined on it, it became hardened. Now you can't blame the sun because the sun is just the sun, but it's the pre-existing condition of the heart of the person that actually determines the result after the sun has shined upon their heart. So, in that respect, you can land, maybe you've got your own place to land, but those are two places to land. The idea that it's the pre-existing condition of the heart of Pharaoh that actually was responding to the sun. So indeed, the sun did harden the clay, but it's not the sun's fault. It's the condition of the clay when Moses' heart was like wax and it melted. So you have that one landing point that I'm trying to explain here, or you have the previous landing point, which is just God's God and God does what he wants because he's in charge and he's operating on a grand scale. So the plagues of Egypt, let's go through these plagues. We can lump them in 5 groups of 2. And you have the blood of the Nile and the frogs, and that was 2 plagues, but you can group them together. The second plague were lice and flies, kind of the insect duo of plagues. The third set was a pestilence on livestock and on people. Livestock died, people were just really tormented. So you have the living animals that were attacked, the livestock and the people. Then you had this cosmic phenomenon of thunder, hail, fire. We'll call it. It's not thunder, hail. It's not just thunder, fire, hail, fire. It is actually thunder, hail, fire. This cosmic, incredible kind of phenomenon that came out of the sky, and then also you would put with that the darkness. And so you have these 4 sets of 2, and then the locusts actually came with the thunder fire. So out of the cosmic, out of the sky came the thunder fire, and then the locusts came out of the sky. Then the darkness came, and that final set of 2 was the darkness and the destruction of the firstborn. Now, like I said, we're not going to talk about the destruction of the firstborn, but I will just let's talk about those first. The order that they came and kind of the result that happened within the scheme of Israel exiting. That's what the book Exodus means, to exit. Within the grand scheme of Israel exiting Egypt, these plagues were an important part of this narrative. Now, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about them. They're kind of self-explanatory. But actually setting them up is the fun for me, like why these plagues. And let me throw one more layer in here on this story that I think is important, is that any nation that exalts the state as the prime authority, like if you take the United States of America, there's a big debate: is America a Christian nation? And you hear people on different sides of that debate. But we can at least say this. We can at least say this: that America is a nation that was constructed under the idea that there's a higher power than the state, and that the truths that seem self-evident, that men were created equal, is a God-given reality. And so the mention of the Creator, the idea that there is, and certainly our forefathers were not all Bible-thumping fundamentalists, okay? They weren't. But they did have this idea that earth should be constructed under a heavenly authority, and that there is an authority greater than the state and greater than the nation, and greater than the president, the legislature, the IRS, the military, the economy, okay? And that constructing a nation aligned with a divine greater authority is something that absolutely is necessary to create a nation that's blessed. And by the way, to go back to my original ideas about Matthew 25 and Jesus judging the nations, and coming down to the idea, maybe boiling it down, that what makes a nation great is the level of compassion in that nation. That level of compassion has to have divine source, okay? That level of compassion just is it can't flow into a nation like the Nile River, okay? It has to flow out of heaven. It has to be a divine anointing on a nation. It has to have a divine source greater than the quote-unquote compassion that is only on a human level and only backed by the state being the prime authority. And the reason that is, in my estimation, is because compassion born out of human reason is only as strong as the perspective of those human beings. And the problem with our perspective is that our perspective changes and our perspective is incomplete. Okay? And so what you find, it seems to me, when you have a certain amount of compassion that is born out of human beings, is that people can be real compassionate towards that group and that group, but then they hate that group. And it's really amazing to me how people become haters when hating people they think are haters. You ever notice that? It's like so many people will say, well, that person's a hater. And then they'll rant and hate on that person feeling completely justified. Almost as if the hate that they have for that group or the hate that they have for those people is completely justified. And human compassion has a way of justifying hate. Human-born compassion has a way of because it's incomplete, our perspectives are incomplete, our perspectives are mixed with the clay of our flesh. And our perspectives are ultimately, self-serving and selfish. That compassion that is created from a humanistic perspective is always incomplete and justifies hate and murder under the guise of compassion. And you see that. You see that throughout history. We shouldn't forget the 20th century and what it taught us. That in many, many ways, the extermination, let's say, of the Jews in Nazi Germany and throughout Europe, those conquered nations by Germany in World War II, that much of that hate that was spewed upon them actually in many people's mind was a result of the compassion and the love they had for their own nation. And you see this with exterminations, especially ethnic-based exterminations, is that my love, let's say, for my religion and my love for my God, and you get this in a fundamentalist way in Islam, that my love for my people and my love for God and my compassion is so strong that I am going to blow myself up and take a bus full of people with me. That's how human compassion really just kind of displays itself, because it's incomplete. It has a single point perspective. Divine compassion, however, is larger than that. And I think that divine compassion that we find in Scripture is the only adequate answer for a state or for a group of people as well as us individually. So hopefully, that made sense to you. So we have Moses then. He comes in, he says, let my people go. And Pharaoh's response is, no, I'm not going to do that. These people are our slaves, and our economy depends on keeping them oppressed. Well, that's the battle of all slave battles. It was the battle in Great Britain, let's say, in the the imperial world of Great Britain and all of the different colonies that they assumed that slave labor was absolutely essential to keep their way of life alive. And the same thing happened in the United States. And this is all clear history. It was the same thing there. And Pharaoh just said, no, I'm not going to let my people go because my best interests are served by keeping them oppressed. My best interest is served by keeping them oppressed, and the best interest of my nation. And so the oppression of the Jews in some convoluted way was probably Pharaoh's expression of the compassion he had for his people. He may have had compassion for his people. He may have loved Egypt, but that compassion for his people and for Egypt then kind of negated any other nationality or ethnicity. And so because of that, he felt completely justified in holding the Jews in bondage, because after all, our way of life is dependent upon their oppression. And Moses said, well, let my people go. And Pharaoh said no. And so here's the layer I think that's important for us understanding these plagues, and I'll hit them here just very quickly. For us to understand them, we would maybe say this, that these plagues are the typical plagues that come to any state or any society or any nation, any geopolitical nation state in the world. These are the plagues that come to them if they do not acknowledge God, align with heaven, and have compassion for people. These are the plagues that happen to them. First of all, the Nile turns into blood. Well, that's the first thing. The Nile River is mentioned many times in the narrative. I mean, usually when Egypt is mentioned, the Nile River is mentioned because it's the source of life, okay? Source of life. And what did Pharaoh say to do with the babies in the last week? The male babies were to be thrown, the male Jewish babies, were to be thrown into the Nile River. And then it's ironic that Moses was found by Pharaoh's daughter in the Nile River. So he was rescued from death in that sense. Well, what did the Nile River then become? The Nile River became a river of blood. It was the shedding of innocent blood. And that is probably the first and primary plague upon any state that does not acknowledge God. There is a river of blood. And so the people for days could not drink the water. And it wasn't just the water in the Nile. It was all the tributaries and the creeks and the ponds and the bowls and the cisterns. Were anything that had water became blood because the land was filled with blood. And that's the first plague on any nation that does not acknowledge God. There is blood in the land. Then secondly, the frogs came up out of that land. Well, a frog. What's a frog famous for? Well, interesting what happens. These frogs come up out of the Nile River. And it says specifically in the story that they went into the living rooms, they went into the bed chambers. So they went into the bedrooms, they were in the living rooms, they were in the kitchens, they were in the bathrooms, they were in the utility rooms, they were in the closets, they were in the garage. And what do frogs do? Well, there's a sense where there's a spiritual element of frogs. In Revelation, it says that the dragon and the two beasts, there were frogs that came out of their mouth, 3 specific frogs that were demon spirits. And so that there's that kind of slant. There's a god, a fertility goddess that in Egypt that had the head of a frog. So frogs are fertile. So there was that kind of idea. But I think that if you think about a frog, what's the thing? What's the thing? Now, if you're a Cajun, you're thinking frog legs, but maybe that's your thing. But I think there's even something more about frogs. Frogs croak. Okay, so frogs croak, and when I say croak, I don't mean die. I mean they make that croaking noise. It's kind of you hear the frogs in the background. And I remember at my grandparents' house they had a pond and it was full of frogs, and you could hear the frogs croaking in the background. It's kind of a nice summer night sound, But yeah, if they're in the pond, but what if they're croaking in your bedroom? What if they're croaking in your kitchen? What if they're croaking while you're trying to watch TV? What if they're croaking in your car? What you just constantly have the frog croaking, making that sound. So here's what I'm saying, is that the first and most evident plague upon a nation that does not acknowledge God but considers the state divine, the first thing is there's going to be a river of blood. There's going to be bloodshed. The second thing is the bloodshed is going to constantly cry out like a croaking frog in every household. And that's what you have here, is you have the national standpoint with the river of blood, and then every household gets affected by it. Every household comes under either the oppression and fear of being killed, or they align themselves with the government. What was it like in East Germany? What was it like? 1 out of 3 people were government informants. And so you either lived in absolute fear and isolation, or you became aligned with the government. You'd be a traitor and turn in your own family, because literally the blood in the land produces this household croaking. Okay, this just absolute annoying reminder that we are under an oppressive, atheistic, assuming a divine place government. Okay, so that's the Nile River and the frogs is kind of like a set. That's the first 2 plagues. The second plagues were lice and fleas. And now this makes it personal. It's like you have the nation and then the household. Now you have personal plagues. And these two plagues, number 3 and 4, the lice, this was something that the magicians now could not duplicate. The magicians were able to turn their staffs into snakes. They were able to turn water into red-looking blood. They were able to kind of give Pharaoh. The Pharaoh's court, we were saying it like this, the Pharaoh's court was able to mimic the divine, but at this point, when it came down to personal redemption, when it came down to personal satisfaction, which the lice and the flies, these two plagues were personal in nature, this is where the magicians just weren't able to do anything. And I think that just speaks to the fact that nations can't personally be redemptive for people. They cannot personally redeem people. So the lice, this was a plague. It came upon people. It came up out of the dirt, out of the earth. And again, there are gods in Egypt that are earth gods. And so this was like to say these earth gods are incapable of stopping this. Only Yahweh can do this. So lice, we know what lice is. And then there's a swarm of flies. And the swarm of flies, this really then made Pharaoh stop and think. And so Pharaoh tried to make a deal. And here's the deal that Pharaoh made. He said the first thing is, okay, because what Moses had said was, we're going to leave and worship. The first thing that Pharaoh said was, okay, you can leave. Okay, you can sacrifice, but you got to do it here. And this is almost like the state coming to the church, in some ways where the church is persecuted, and saying, okay, you can sacrifice to your God and you can do your thing, but you got to do it here. Moses says, no, we're going to leave. And then Pharaoh, in this same passage, makes a second deal and says, well, you can leave, but you cannot go far. Just right over there. And Moses is like, no, we're not going to stay here, and we are going to leave, and we're going to go far. Now, later on in chapters, there was a third deal that Pharaoh tries to make, and that deal was, okay, you can leave, and you can go far, but you can't take your cattle, your possessions. You got to leave your cattle here. You got to leave all your livestock here. So again, this is like the government trying to make a deal with God's people. It may be maybe the devil trying to make a deal with you personally. It's like, okay, you can go to church, just don't stop sinning. Don't change your lifestyle. Well, okay, you can go to church, but hold on to your possessions. It's almost like these deals are representative of what Satan tries to do with individual Christians. So just sacrifice here and stay in the land. Okay, well, you can go a little ways, but not far. Oh, okay, you can go and you can go far and you can leave, but you've got to keep all your possessions here. Like, you cannot take those into the kingdom of God. You cannot transition those into... No, we're going to take our possessions. Then finally he said this, Pharaoh said, okay, you can go, you can sacrifice, you can leave, you can go far, take your cattle, take whatever, but keep your little ones, they have to stay. Your kids and grandkids got to stay. And it's like, no, we're going to go far, we're going to sacrifice, we're going to take our kids with us, and we're going to take our possessions, and we're going to completely move out of here. And so the flies, this fourth plague really starts the deal making, and that's kind of a side story. That is interesting. So we go now to the third set, which you had the Nile River and the frogs. Then you had lice and fleas. Now livestock and human beings are going to be touched by these plagues. So the fifth plague is livestock, pestilence. It's a death of the livestock. Now here's what's interesting about the whole thing that's going on. Is all of that was happening to the Egyptians, but where God's people were, they were being protected. And that is an absolute clear statement that Moses is making. Moses is saying, when you align yourself in a different alignment with the divine being greater than any person in the state, that we're aligned with our divine creator, that there is a protection and there is a blessing in that camp. Whereas the other ways that the nations are aligning themselves governmentally and culturally, that there is death, there's the river of death, the frogs come out, there's lice and flies, of course, Beelzebub's called the Lord of the Flies. I mean, all of that has just a tremendous amount of information to unpack. But now we have the pestilence on the cattle and the livestock. These are food sources, of course, and they're dying. It's like there's death in the economy because there's a food shortage, and and you can imagine what that would have been like. And then the sixth plague, not just the livestock, but then the people had these burning sores, and Moses does something that almost seems ecological. He goes to a kiln which produces smoke, pollutants, and he takes the ashes and he throws them up in the air until there's just a cloud of dust, almost like a pollutant that's in the atmosphere, produced by a kiln, a man-made object. And it puts burning sores upon people. And the people are in absolute misery. And it's interesting, at this point in the story, here's what Moses says, that even the magicians, now remember, the magicians were able to mimic the divine for a short time, but they were unable to bring relief to the people. When it came to a certain point, specifically with lice, they were unable then to duplicate any of that. And now at this point, they're so sore and so miserable, they don't even go to the king's court anymore. Magicians they're done. Like, they're completely out of the picture at this point. And the burning sores make life absolutely miserable. And again, I think that the point of this is to say, if you have a nation that is aligned like Egypt with this oppressive divine attitude at the top, with no compassion and no recognition of heaven, aligned strictly to benefit people, to benefit men, to benefit the people at the top, you are going to have these types of plagues. On the other hand, there's a different alignment, a different cultural aspect, a cultural formation under the alignment of heaven, and that's where the blessings are. Now we come to 7 and 8. So you have the blood and the frogs, you have lice and flies, you have livestock and people being affected. Now 7 and 8, thunder, hail, fire, and the locust. And this comes out of the sky. And what it does, it attacks the crops. That's really kind of the end result of this. So you have this thunder and hail producing fire, and it burns up grass and it burns up trees. So now you have an absolute economic failure that's happening in this nation. It's like an absolute economic failure because there's been a livestock shortage. Now the grass and the greenery, the vegetables are being burned up by this hailfire. And it was thunder in the skies and hail coming out of the skies. And then from the skies come locusts, these swarms of locusts. And it says specifically that the locusts attacked the barley and the flax. And barley was a food source, of course, and usually a food source for the poor, where wheat would be a food source for maybe the wealthy. So now you have the idea that the poor are absolutely in abject starvation, and the flax that is attacked is where they made linen. And this was famous all over the world, probably one of the great trading exports that put Egypt on the map was the ability to make garments out of the flax, out of the linen. And now this is being eaten up by the locusts. So at this point, after 8 plagues, you have a total and complete economic failure. This nation is crumbling. And it all could have been avoided had Pharaoh just said yes. But instead, his arrogance, and it was a challenge. Pharaoh saying, I'm God, and Yahweh saying, I don't think so. And we see then the absolute economic collapse where the livestock and then the vegetables, the grassland, the barley, and now the flax being eaten up was the source of wealth in the export business. And so that is now being destroyed. And then we come to the final 2 plagues. You have the blood and the frogs, the lice and flies, the livestock, and the people being affected. the thunder, hail, fire, and locusts coming out of the sky. And then the fifth, these two, the darkness and the death of the firstborn. The darkness means just what it means. Maybe the greatest god. I think I might be right in saying that Ra was the greatest and most worshipped god in the Egyptian pantheon. And Ra is a sun god, and the sun did not shine for 3 days. Absolute darkness. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face, as they say. Here's the weird thing. In Goshen, where Israel lived, there was light. And here's where we get to this point. We're going to stop here because I want to talk about the death of the firstborn and Passover next week. But at this point, here's what you have. You have an absolute contrast of light and darkness. That Egypt is absolutely dark and Israel is absolutely light. That's ultimately where you get. And the contrast is striking. Absolute darkness, you couldn't see your own family, couldn't see your friends standing in front of you. You couldn't recognize people. And that's the thing about darkness. You stumble, you fall, you're confused, you're lost, and you don't recognize people. And you'll see that in the text. They did not recognize. They couldn't see each other. Couldn't recognize. I don't even recognize this place anymore. I don't even recognize this nation anymore. I don't even recognize what we've become. But look, over there, the people of God. And Isaiah the prophet kind of maybe played on this and had this in mind, that there's a great light that is shining on the people of God. And interesting, that in the seventh plague, when Moses says that thunder and all that's going to start coming down out of heaven, hail and fire, some of the Egyptians got smart, and it says that they started pulling their livestock indoors to protect them. And I think that it is very telling that as these plagues continued and the people of God were shown to be blessed, that the people of Egypt started looking to the people of God and saying, I think I'm going to join this bunch. Yeah, I think I'm going to go over here. I'm going to start listening to them. And that has been played over many, many times in history, and maybe is where we're at today. Like, we've got to have a light on the church. The church should be the light. Let me say that way. That we are this light of the world in that sense, where we reflect the light of Christ. And we have to be the light, and we have to be different. And we have to be walking in the full realization that God is God, and aligning our personal lives and our homes and our nation as best we can in the realm and the sphere of authority that we obtain. We have to align those things in kingdom alignment. And if we do, we're blessed. And I think that people will start, we would say, maybe coming to the light, or I don't want to say coming to our side as if we're in opposition. We're not in opposition with anyone. We are in contrast, but not opposition. And that's an important differentiation to make. Okay? So let's stop there. And next week, we're going to talk about the plague of the firstborn and Passover and the full exodus of Israel as they leave Egypt. So thank you so much for being a part of this today.